Yeah. Oh, no, I changed my mind.
Okay.
Okay. That's all right.
So we have a situation where we had a driver just earlier this week, wrong on Wednesday, I said, run a stop sign to make a left-hand turn in front of an oncoming bus, so she didn't get caught behind the bus. She's pulled off while we investigate. That wouldn't fall under 6, even though I have clear video evidence as reckless operation, or would it?
So the question is, a particular driving behavior, does it qualify as reckless or is it something else? The case where if you have the evidence on your vehicle camera, so you see what's happening, and so you're going to take appropriate employment action, would there be a police action involved? Would they cite? Would they not cite? Defining it as reckless or not reckless when law enforcement's not involved, that's going to end up on your plate. And so it might be, here's a case where you sit down with the superintendent, the business manager, and the lawyers and say, okay, how do we feel about this one? Is this essentially the same as a reckless op? Would we want to use the same penalty? I would say that you don't have to, because they're not going to be convicted of reckless op.
Right.
Or you may say, well, we're going to follow the same standard. Or maybe you do a last chance agreement with the employee saying, you know, if you even wink at me the wrong way, you're done. I think you have latitudes here. I don't think, because there's no conviction of a motor vehicle crime, law enforcement's not going to do it based on your camera evidence.
And the reason I asked is the railroad thing.
Yeah, so the railroad is different.
Right now, yeah, railroads, you either did or didn't.
Yeah, it was me, right, let's face it, made some changes in the railroad language during my tenure with the state because we had a problem. I mean, we had a case in Cincinnati, ironically, it was a district where I used to work, and a driver that used to work for me, that went across a railroad in Cincinnati area, we'll include at that, in front of an oncoming train. And the railroad reported the violation, they identified the driver, police department came in and cited the driver, went to court, the court threw it out. So that it wasn't witnessed by law enforcement, and therefore they weren't going to uphold the conviction. And that was so egregious to all of us, thinking, wow, you know, how can a bus driver who's charged with the safety of these kids do something like that? So working with our stakeholders group at the time, we ramped up the language on that one that says, you know, that one doesn't take a ticket or a court. We really don't care. If the engineer sitting on that locomotive sees big yellow going across, we don't want that driver going across. So that language admittedly goes much further. All right, we're going to jump into Rule 6. Now, remember what I told you back in November, December, that we got a package of rules. They're law now. But there's also a new rule sitting out there waiting. And so the problem that we all have is when the drivers and the OBIs come back from pre-service class and the instructor said, here's a new rule, here's how we're doing things, start it now. And then you come to me and I say, no, we don't start it now. Rule is rule until rule is changed. Right? That's true. So I've given you 2 copies of the rule. So the first copy here that we're looking at with the blue banner on the top, that's the way it lives right now. Now, having said that, the new rule is actually before JCAR right now. It's in its final steps, and I don't anticipate any changes. So we're going to see some changes hitting probably somewhere around March, April, might even be as late as May. So we're going to look through the edited version of the rules. So jump back to page 35. And this will help me to show you what changes are coming so that we understand what's going on. So yours are in color, right? So there's all different kinds of colors print on here. And if you're like me, the blue is really hard to read. So the top of the first page is all about supervisors' requirements. And I'm gonna skip that, we're gonna jump down to school bus driver. So the bottom line here, and I know there's been some confusion because we had a previous administrator at ODE that kind of ignored what this said. The minimum age for a school transportation person is 21, period. There's no exceptions to that. And I know Mr. Harmon told some folks that 18 was acceptable. It is not. This code has been 21 since 2012. If you have an 18 or a 19 or a 20-year-old driver out there, find something else for them to do until they get a little bit older. In all likelihood, the insurance isn't covering them anyway. They can get a CDL, but they just can't drive a bus. Okay. We flip the page. So, and this was your question earlier when we were talking about what are the traffic convictions that would violate somebody. So, we're on page 36 now. 3A, again, here's where it says, the law says you got to do 2 checks a year. Here's where it says you do them through ODE, right? And then what violates them? This is the state standard. If they've got more than 6 points in the last 2 years, they can't drive a bus. If you don't like that policy and you think 4 is better, the law says you can make it 4, right? You can't let them go further, but you can make it tighter. Now let's talk about points on an abstract for just a moment. You're all now seeing abstracts with a lifetime history. You probably noticed that points are on there even for things that are 10, 15, 20 years old. Points never come off the abstract. What we talk about in law is whether points are current or not current. And so when we talk about points dropping off, that's not really accurate. What we have to look at is what they got points for in the last 2 years. And so you don't look at the conviction date, you look at the date of the offense. So if it was speed, and they were convicted on March 1st, but they did it on April 1st, those 2 points are valid from April 1st, 2 years forward. So if you look at their abstract, and they've got 6 points printed out there, count back 2 years. If only 2 points are in the last 2 years, they're okay to use. So you have to look at that. You have to pay attention to the dates on that. So 6 points is in different violations. And then we have the OMVI or DUI, however it shows up, that's a 10-year. So they're out of here for like 10 years. Right? And then here's the next one. This is what you were talking about. 2 or more serious traffic violations as listed in the CDL code. I don't have that in this handout. So those CDL codes, some of those are, you wouldn't think it's a serious violation. I mean, one of those is you get caught driving without your license in your pocket. That's considered to be a serious CDL violation. And one of my districts, we had lockers in our driver's room, and women used to like to leave their pocketbooks inside the locker so it went on the bus. And they had the mistaken impression that, well, if something would happen, they could come back their license or he would grab their pocketbook and take it to them. Either way, you know, if you're driving on the vehicle and you have to have a CDL and you don't have it with you, that's considered to be a serious violation. So you're kind of putting yourself at the mercy of a law enforcement person. They could hit you with that right then and there. Operating a CDL vehicle without the right endorsements is a serious violation.
And that's in their personal vehicle or the school bus,
Yes,
right?
it is.
Okay.
So all these things, and I'm glad you asked that question, all these things apply to no matter what you're driving. I mean, if Mama took your keys away, there's that one country song where that guy drives his John Deere to the bar, right? And you're on the John Deere and you get stopped for running a red light, that counts. Can't remember who sang that, but. So here's the railroad crossing violation. And we talked a little bit about the language there, right? And then again, in paragraph E, nothing here stops you from adding more requirements. So you can set the bar higher. That's perfectly acceptable. There are a number of districts in the state that says, if your record comes back and you have an LMVI on it anywhere, you're not going to drive one of our buses. There are other states that say, well, we'll use whatever state that might be. That's your call. So how do we make those decisions at the district level? What is you have a very powerful tool that's the barometer of your community standards. What's that tool? Don't ever call a board member a tool. But the board is your tool, right? Your board reflects your community standards. And so that's why some of these standards need to exist in board policy. Because your board will vote on policies that they believe reflects the community standards. Now here at OSBA, we have a whole team of staff, including Diana, and that's primarily what they do, is they work with school boards to help them write policy, modify policy, and adopt things. And there are some policies that are required, but then there are some policies that boards adopt because that reflects the local community standards. All right, going down the page, item 4, guess what? They have to have a CDL, right? That's for, now remember we're talking about bus drivers here. Van drivers are 2 pages later. And now 5 and 6 are the 2 certificates. So every bus driver and every van driver has to have 2 certificates. 5 is the one that we issue under 332710. And 6 is the training certificate. That's pre-service.
But do they have to carry those on their person?
They do not have to carry those with them. I've heard that said in the field. There's nothing in the code that says it has to be posted on the bus or hanging in the bus or in their wallet. I gave my driver's copies of these, but we always kept them in a driver file. And that's really where it should be, in the driver's records. 7. So let's be real clear about sentence 7 on here. Physical capability of safely and appropriately lifting and managing preschool and special needs children. This is not TA. This is separate from a TA. This is where, as a district, you could implement some other standards that says, and you want to be careful when you do this, they need to be performance-based. You know, maybe you need a standard that says our drivers need to be able to get to the back door of the bus. There are some drivers that can't get through the aisle, right? And then you have to decide, is that appropriate in your district or not? I don't know how you can expect a driver to inspect the back seat if physically they can't get between the seats. To me, that's a problem. But this is where you have the opportunity to think, okay, we need to have certain things. You were asking me about a driver he has a driver that's got a medical issue and she's recovering from it. And the question is, boy, is she really the right person to drive the wheelchair? Because those drivers have to do a little bit more physical stuff than other drivers do, right? So how do we answer that question? So at the district, you set the standard. Who makes the decision? I would encourage that not to be you, right? That's where you rely on whoever's doing the T8s for you to make the evaluation. Let me back up a minute here. We had a conversation last week that I want to have today. On the certificates that are issued by your superintendent, so the 332710 employment certificate, how many of you signed those yourselves? Anybody? You did? It's all right, I won't think less of you for that. How many of you have a superintendent sign it? How many of you has a superintendent says, don't put any of that junk on my desk, that's someone else's problem, right? So that happens. I would suggest to you, and this is just career advice from someone who's done this for 40 plus years, probably you want someone else to sign these. What's that certificate signify once it's signed? It means that we've checked all the driver's credentials and they're all good. you folks are all incredibly busy. There's not enough hours in a day and enough days in the week for you to get your jobs done. Some of you just do transportation, some of you got food service, some of you got grounds and other stuff out there. Think about this certificate as a capstone on a process. And the process is, are all these elements in place for a driver? And if they are, then someone signs a note that says, yep, we've checked. And so I think it's good if you're the first step in that process, you make sure everything's in there, and we'll talk about file and file organization after lunch. But then I also think it's probably wise that someone else double checks you on it. Right? And that way, if there's a problem with the driver's credentials, it's not just you in the soup, it's someone else also. And whether it's the superintendent or the superintendent's secretary or another administrator, I think it's wise for you to have a backup plan so someone else is checking these along with you. Make it more than just a piece of paper that you stamp or initial or something. That's not in the code. It's not law. I just think it's something you should think through. All right. Bottom of page 36 is where it starts to talk about criminal background check and then the negative pre-employment drug test. Now, interestingly enough, this rule has gone through all kinds of stakeholder hearings. It's in front of JCAR right now. It's going to get introduced pretty much the way it is. And probably needs to be changed already. But probably what needs to be in it is something that says district will register with the clearinghouse and run a query. Because that's now a federal requirement, but it's missing from the code. So if you had not been to one of our classes or not been to a clearinghouse in service and you just read this, you wouldn't know. Right? So probably already a need for a change here. All right, next page, bus aid. The reason why I want to point this out, and I will own this, there has been an error in the requirements for bus aids for about 15 years. We had a line in there that said bus aids had to have a negative pre-employment drug test. So here's the whole thing. Who mandates the drug tests? FED. Right? It's a DOT program. It's not an Ohio program. It's only incumbent upon folks that hold a CDL and are operating in a safety-sensitive role. That does not include aides. So we've had a requirement in here for a long time that said aides had to have drug tests. There's nothing under federal code that mandates that. So it's actually coming out of Ohio's code. In our research and talking to districts around the field, a lot of districts weren't doing it anyway. You could if you wanted to, but it's coming out of Ohio's code. So the one other point I want to make on bus aid is there's actually no required certificate for these folks. There was some confusion coming out of communications put out by ODE a couple of years ago. There is nothing in the code that requires a bus aid, attendant, whatever you call them, to have any permit. Student activity permit, classroom aid, any of that stuff, there's nothing in the code. Yes, sir?
Will you please send that email to my treasurer?
Yeah, yeah, ours too.
So here's how you spend that. If your district is requiring you to do that, what you need to ask the treasurer, whoever requiring it, and make sure the HR director and the superintendent hear the question is, let's find out what section of code requires bus aides to have a permit. They will not be able to come up with an answer for you. You could, if you wanted to, require them. So that could be a local policy. What I'm hearing from districts, and it's probably your experience also, is that's an extra hurdle you have to step across before you get somebody to work inside an aid. It's a cost thing, and it does put them off a little bit, but there's nothing in code that requires it. So if you challenge them and say, well, you know, we're all about trying to figure out how we can get more employees and how we can minimize costs, why are we doing this? What's the law? There is nothing.
Our treasurer makes our monitors pay for it themselves. the certificate.
Do you have a labor agreement in the district?
We do.
Do you?
That's a hint.
That's not what.
I didn't say anything. All right, next page, page 38. Van drivers. So what's changing with van drivers? Bottom line, almost nothing. There are some edits in here, so there are some adjustments. I will tell you that there was a very lively conversation. There were staff at ODE that wanted to require drug and alcohol tests for van drivers. And we pointed out to them under what authority. And then they realized that, well, there is no authority, it would be a state level thing. And then they said, well, how come we require it for AIDS? And I said, that's a mistake. So now it's gone from AIDS and it's not showing up under the van driver. Now, important point. You as a district could say, you want to drive a van in our district, you have to do the drug and alcohol test. But if you do that, here's what you need to understand. That is a non-DOT test. So when you fill out the form and send them to the lab, you have to mark it as non-DOT. Because it's non-DOT, if they fail that test, there's no federal sanction. You actually need to have a rule in place in your district that says, here's what we're going to do with these people if they refuse the test or if they test positive. Because all the federal sanctions, they don't apply. It's a non-DOT test. And just to make it even muddier still, and Doug will touch on this in his thing, non-DOT tests don't get registered in the clearinghouse. That's all off the table. So if you want to test your van drivers, you are welcome to do so. A lot of districts do. That's okay. But know that that's a local thing. That's a regulation that you have added. And my advice is if you add that testing requirement, make sure you add the consequences also. Because there are no federal consequences.
Even if we have them into the system, they still don't keep that record.
You can't add them into the clearinghouse system. No, because they're not CDL.
I mean, we're required, I just wonder what the ramifications.
While there are no ramifications, if you require it, unless you have ramifications in your board policy, your HR policy. Yeah. So it's not a bad idea to require this. I'm just saying make sure in this case you understand this is outside of federal authority, local authority. You have the authority to do it. You just need to make sure that you not only test, but you say what happens if you fail a test.
Are van drivers still subject to post-accident requirements?
There are 4 levels of drug and alcohol testing, and it's a package deal. There's pre-employment drug. We don't care if they're drunk before we hire them. So there's pre-employment drug. There's random testing. There's reasonable suspicion testing. And there's post-accident testing in certain cases. All 4 of those are elements of the federal DOT drug and alcohol testing program. And so, if it's a van driver and you send them for any of those, you can. But they're all non-DOT. It's all local authority. Now, it might be that your board says, we recognize there's no federal requirement for this class of employees. However, we are going to use the exact same requirements as the feds and the exact same consequences as the feds. So you could do it simply like that. Or you could say, if they're caught under the influence, they're terminated, or you could say they get a last chance agreement, whatever you do. You just need to make sure you have the whole thing in place and not just part of it. Right? So back into the real text here, drivers. So there's a new paragraph on the bottom there. It's in blueprint. That whole paragraph, pretty long, only applies to the school for the deaf. ODE wanted the school for the deaf to have the authority to use hearing impaired drivers for their vans. None of the rest of you get to do that, only the school for the deaf. 7B on the next page. And I want to point this out to you because it was a huge discussion point around the table. The pre-service instructors wanted van driver evaluations to only be done by OBIs. We argued that that's not appropriate. A district could decide to have their van drivers evaluated by an OBI, but you don't have to. At the end of the day, when we rolled out the van driver regulations in 2001, there's a number of parts of it. It's all in Rule 19. One of them is there has to be a driving evaluation of that employee. Folks have read much more into that than the writer intended. I know the writer pretty well. Right? The intention of that was that somebody rides with that driver to make sure they're not a flaming idiot when they go down the road. That they act professionally, they understand what a turn signal is, and it's not a race to get away from the red light. Whatever your standards are. And so the original writing was intended that before a coach comes in and says, I'm going to drive a bus, or not a bus, but a van, somebody rides with that coach. You're already checking the B&B record, you're doing a physical, but someone needs to ride with them and say, okay, they're a reasonable driver. So what's happening in some districts is there are some districts where the OBI has been taking these, let's face it, for the most part, it's usually either coaches or teachers, and they're making them go through 12 hours of training behind the wheel. That was never the intent of this rule. For the most part, these are folks that already work with children every day. All we need to do is make sure they understand, okay, what's a flare? How do you light a flare? What's emergency equipment? What do you do if there's a flat tire? Things like that. So here's the bottom line, just enough of the baloney. In rule here, it says 7B, they have to do a driving performance evaluation and review by a certified OBI or by the superintendent's designee. So at the end of the day, it's your call. You want the OBIs to do it, that's fine. My advice would be remind the OBI that's not a bus driver. They don't need to worry about emergency evacuation and all the other stuff, but I think common sense here has to prevail. Any questions about Rule 6?
I'm sure it's in here somewhere, but van drivers have to be 21 as well.
Yes, they do. It's actually page 38, F1, the third of the way down.
Oh,
Be at least 21 years of age.
okay.
Got it? All right, Rule 7, this is the physical. And I'll go through this fairly quickly because there's really not much changing here. Paragraph B, this is what I told you about when I read you the law. This says you in your district appoint someone to do these physicals. So it could be someone or it could be a practice.
I have a question.
Yep.
We're a county consortium, so does our board still have to approve them since the county picks who we go to?
Question is, if you're a local, does the county do this or does your board do this? The law changed in, I think it was 2012. And up until then, locals were required to do their physicals according to how the ESC said to do it. The law changed in 12 that now says you can use the ESC for this, but you have the authority to do it on your own also. So what happens in a number of counties, and ESCs now are not really county-based anymore. They've become more territorial and opened up. Some ESCs offer the physical as a service, so they'll contract with an entity, and because they have a little more buying power, so they get a little better price. And then the locals, and where I was the other day, even the city districts all use the same service. Do you have to go there? No, that's your choice. If you're not using the county's service, then your board would have to appoint someone that provides the service for your employees.
Okay, but if we do use the county, we don't have to board.
No, you don't have to take action because they've taken action. Now, it is important for them to take action. So here's, this will open a can of worms, but I need to do it anyway. One of the biggest problems that I've seen in my 40 years in the state, and this is changing, it's changing for the better, is that there are still districts that say to the drivers, here's your TA form, go get a physical from your doc and bring it back. That's not wise for a couple of reasons. One is, when you allow a driver to go to their own doctor, that doctor has actually got a vested interest in making sure they pass. They want to keep them employed so they keep the business, right? Secondly, that doctor may not know the needs of the job, the profile of the job, and they may not be comfortable with the TA form itself. They may say, okay, here's another form. I'm going to do my own regular physical, and then I'll just initial this other form because of this. We actually had this problem in Dayton, not anymore because all the staff changed, but we had a public health doctor who was a graduate of Dayton who was doing TA physicals for the district, and it was a great service. It was a huge discount, so it was underpricing it and doing all these things, and we ended up doing a driver audit, went out to meet with this guy, and I asked him a question about blood pressure, and he said, oh yeah, that's fine. And so, well, what do you consider fine? And the numbers he shared with me said, that doesn't match what's on our form. And then we started talking about diabetes and insulin dependent, and it turned out, here we had a doc who meant well. He was a physician. He was in a place to help the district that he graduated from, but wasn't familiar with the requirements on a TA. That actually does everything a disservice. And so we ended up with some drivers that really weren't qualified, putting themselves and children at risk. So it's real important for your drivers to go to somebody that works for you, not for them. Because you want to set the standard. You want to say to them, here's what's on the T8, here's what I want you to do. We have some districts that add agility tests to the T8. And you can do that if the relationship between you and the doc. You can't do that if you don't have a relationship and you're just paying off a bill. Okay. Paragraph C1, there's a bunch of red letters in there, but here's the bottom line, nothing changed. They have to have a physical approved before they drive a bus in their next school year. There's only one exception to that. And that is if you hire a driver after January 1st, their physical carries through the next school year. But everybody else has to get their physical renewed. Remember what the window is? After May 1st and before they drive in the next school year. So what ODE does is the very last day of August, if you don't have a new physical in there, their system flips everything to inactive. And so it's, September 1st is a really ugly day because there's a bunch of emails going out. And some of those might be van drivers who don't drive until the spring. Well, it's no big deal, but the system flips them all on September 1st. And so if the bus driver, it is a big deal if they're driving the bus. Now, practical advice. If your school doesn't get out until May 21st, don't send your drivers for a physical until May 22nd. Because if you send them for a physical and school's still open and they fail because of blood pressure, you're now down a driver. Right? They're immediately out of service until they can pass that thing. So this is all about self-preservation, folks. Don't let them take physicals until after your last day of school. Because if they fail, you're in trouble. And there's no way to get around it. You can't say, well, I'll ignore that one because the last one was good. It doesn't work that way. Right? So the smart thing to do is wait till the day after school's out and then let them struggle through. All right, we're going to flip to page 42. This is one of those pages that's got 3 different page numbers on it. The only one that counts is the top right. Diane didn't teach me how to fix the other ones. Right? Secret information that only the AAs know.
Yeah.
So the section in administration, which is paragraph E, This is all for you, and that's what you have to remember. So T1, any driver who's been out for a prolonged absence, who has a significant change in their state of health, may be required by a school bus owner to be re-examined in accordance with this rule. So if you got a driver who had surgery, a broken arm, they get sick, they're out for a while, and they come back to you with a note from their own doctor, could you accept that? You could. Should you accept it? Probably not. Probably send them back to the T8 physical. So a re-exam is real important, again, so that you know they can do the terms of the job as you set them out. So you send them back for a new T8. Who pays for that? You. All right, paragraph 2, when things start to go bad. You send a driver for a physical and they fail it. What this is the hard-coded standard when things are a little contentious. You need to notify a driver within 15 days that they failed. They get 15 days to say to you, hey, I want another physical. So that's the mandate. So things are a little bit tense in the bus garage, right? And you're worried about unions getting involved and grievances and all this kinds of stuff. Here's the windows and code. You have to tell them within 15 days if they failed. They get 15 days to say to you, I want a new exam. If they do that, then you send them for another exam. Not to the same doc that failed them, but to someone else that you decide on. So if you have approved, your board's approved a practice, then you say to that practice, I need someone else to examine this driver. I will also say to you, good management dictates that when you send that driver for a re-exam, you let the new doc know why they failed the first one. Don't make this like the Stanley Cup where they're just guessing, right? And then, if they fail that second exam, what the rule says is that's it. They get no more chances. So that's really cold and dispassionate. So now let's talk about real life. You have a driver that fails their physical, maybe they got a blood pressure problem. And that's an employee that you would prefer to keep, salvage, if you will, and have work for you. So you bring them in, you sit down and say, listen, I know you failed your physical. We'll send you for another physical. But before we do that, why don't you go meet with your own doc and see if you can get yourself fixed. I shouldn't say fixed, but get whatever the problem is, get it resolved. If it's high blood pressure, solve it. If it's a blood sugar problem, maybe you can control it under diet. And give them an opportunity to work through this. And then you say to them, when you feel ready, let us know. Now, I wouldn't let that stretch forever and a day. You know, I'd pick a day in the future saying, you know, how about 3 months? Can we agree on you come back in 3 months? Or sooner if you're doing better. Then we'll send you for another physical and then we can get you back to work. There's nothing that says you can't be compassionate and work with folks. On the flip side, if that's a driver you think, oh, thank God they failed the physical. Right? Not that we have any drivers like that. Know that there is a process in place. It's called due process. 15 days to let them know, 15 days for them to let you know they did another one, and you send them. Then the results of the second one are binding. We all okay with this? This is a pretty important section for you to be very comfortable with.
Their 15 days starts as soon as they get notification from us.
Yeah, so,
Today, if I know you failed, tomorrow I let them know, so they 15 days from tomorrow.
yeah. And if they don't let you know, you don't have to send them back.
Do you do that by certified mail?
Yeah, Tim's
I mean,
question
obviously,
is, should
I'm gonna
it
have
be,
a conversation with them, but should I back that up?
yeah, should it be certified mail? You know, I think it probably should be a process that the district is comfortable with, however you do things, whether it's certified mail, whether it's someone else in the room. I think it's always smart to do things backed up in writing. I think at the heart of the question is, it should be whatever the formal process is your district uses for other things. Sometimes the postal service does worse with certified mail than they do with regular mail, so they might not ever get it. My post office doesn't deliver certified mail. Whatever your district comfortable.
I needed to tell me there's something certified, like you what.
Yeah. All right, so if you jump back to Rule 48, page 48, so we're now under Rule 10. So what's interesting was I printed these in November. When they went to JCAR and they made one more change. So take your pen, on paragraph F where it says off-road CDL maneuvers, put a big X through everything that's underlined. We had recommended that ODE take that off. They decided not to, and then they changed their mind. So the bottom line is there's still a requirement in here for off-road CDL maneuvers, but the detailed maneuvers have been taken out of code. They didn't belong in code in the first place. Now they're out. Flip the page to 50. So let's look at the new language, paragraph 3. School bus driver will demonstrate, this is a bad word for me, familiarity with the topics covered in the pre-service training. So what's that mean? It means they gotta take a test. Right? And then 4, so this isn't new, it's just in a new location, but we do need to talk about 4 because as recently as 2 days ago, I heard an OBI that was misinterpreting this. So what this says is once the driver's been trained and they've gone through everything they need to go through, then A, and again, the language has changed, so I'll tell you what the new language says. They have to observe a route with an experienced school bus driver and kids. So scratch out morning, afternoon, pickup, and discharge, because all those words are gone. And the new language says they have to observe a route with a bus driver and kids. That's a ride-along, right? Now let's be real clear. It does not have to be the OBI. Here's my spin on that. It probably should not be the OBI. Right? Because I think it's time for the driver to see how others do it in the district. So should you hand pick the driver they ride with? Oh, shoot, yes. Right? But probably not the OBI, and let them ride with it. It's a ride along so they start to see how things are happening. So the reason this came to my attention is because I have a district that doesn't have their own OBI. They contract with a neighboring district. And the OBI said to the superintendent, well, now you have to pay for your driver to come ride with me on my route. And that's not right, because actually the driver needs to see how things are going to be in the district where they're going to work. That's the intent of it. So that's A. B, and again, put an X through morning, afternoon, pickup, and discharge. Because what the requirement says is they have to drive a route with students and an experienced driver on board. So I'm putting my training hat back on as a supervisor thinking, okay, what am I going to do? That same driver that they watched yesterday, today, let them drive that route with the driver coaching them. Right? Again, I think probably not the OBI makes more sense to me. Because this way they're going to get some real tangible experience about how things happen in your district. So they need to drive a bus, a route with kids on there, with the experienced driver on board.
They do like the morning ride along in the afternoon.
So the question is, could they ride in the morning and drive in the afternoon? Absolutely. Morning and afternoon has been taken out of the rules. So you could split it. Or you could say all day. Or you could say, I need you to drive this afternoon. So first trip is a ride, second one's a drive, and this afternoon you're going to work yourself. Okay? Whatever your needs are. Again, this is not Doesn't have to be with the OBI. Question
Is
is
that
that?
before they go and take the actual test?
No, this is after
they
they've
take
tested.
the test,
So
okay.
this is after all the other requirements are done, they've got their CDL,
Okay,
you've done the T9, they've passed their OBI driving evaluation, so it's after all that.
if somebody wants to look at possibly driving, does an FBI and everything need to be done before they ride the bus with the driver?
Can
If
I
they're
save
just
that question?
testing the water?
Can I save that question for after lunch?
Sure.
Because it's a, you know, you would think it's a simple question, but when we look at the clearinghouse and all the other stuff, we really have to think about what we do first, what we do second, what we do third, so we will talk about that, I
Okay.
promise.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am?
Just to clarify, so when you tell us to cross out the morning and afternoon routes, how long, are they to do one ride along a whole day, or just a half a day, and they could drive that afternoon?
It's not codified, which means you get to decide.
Okay.
There's nothing in there codified anymore that says morning or afternoon, all, partial, anything. It just says, the first sentence says they have to ride along with an experienced driver, and the second one is they have to drive with an experienced driver. Period. And then the third part of that is that driver needs to offer some comments, but here's the great part, that's gone in its entirety. Right, so that third part's gone in its entirety. There's really, should that driver offer feedback, both to the candidates who you absolutely, but it doesn't become documented as part of the training